Hello, my name is Boris Sidoruk, Chair of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress National Internment Committee. I'm here to introduce the topic and the people that have brought us here today. More than 80,000 Ukrainians were branded enemy aliens during Canada's first national internment operations of 1914 to 1920. In addition, almost 5,000 Ukrainians, including men, women, and children, were interned as forced laborers in 24 Canadian concentration camps during the First World War and afterwards. More than 8,000 people were interned in total. People were interned not because of anything they had done, but only because of where they had come from, who they were. There was no evidence then, nor has there been found since, of divided loyalties on part of the victims of these internment measures. In the late 1990s, representatives from the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association, myself and Mikhailo Ilnitsky, met with the Honourable Jason Kenney, then Member of the Parliament for Calgary Southeast, introducing him to Canada's first national internment operations of 1914 to 1920. Prime Minister Stephen Harper appointed the Honourable Jason Kenney as Secretary of State for Multiculturalism and Canadian Identity to negotiate with the representatives of the Ukrainian Canadian community an honourable settlement of claims arising from Canada's first national internment operations of 1914 to 1920. These representatives were Dr. Lubomir Lutsuk from the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association, Dr. Pavlo Grod, President of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and Mr. Andriy Klarashowski, President of the Taras Shevchenko Foundation. On May 8, 2008, an agreement to create a $10 million endowment fund was signed by the Honourable Jason Kenney and Mr. Klarashowski. The Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund was created to manage these funds. The purpose being to educate Canadians and commemorate this little-known episode of Canadian history. The Honourable Jason Kenney has agreed to share his thoughts and journey through his decades of involvement with Canada's first national internment operations. The Honourable Tyler Shandro, who served as a cabinet minister in the then Premier Jason Kenney's Alberta provincial government, will be asking Honourable Jason Kenney questions about his internment journey. I would like to thank the Echoes of Ukraine for recording the event. I would also like to acknowledge the Shevchenko Foundation, World War I Internment Legacy Fund for their financial support for this recording.
Привіт. Thank you so much for joining us here today for this conversation, Premier. I want to begin this conversation going back about 25 years ago. You had a meeting in your constituency office with the Ukrainian community, and the issue of internment operations was raised. I wanted to ask you an open-ended question about what memories you have from that conversation about the internment operations, because for me, growing up as a Ukrainian Canadian, third, fourth generation, depending on how you count it, I didn't know about internment operations until the 90s when I went to university.
Right.
When did you first learn about internment operations? Was it at that meeting, or did you know?
I think maybe at that meeting, Tyler, I'm a big history buff and know Canadian history and war history very well. And when Boris and his delegation from the local Ukrainian community presented this to me, I was, I think, astonished. I was surprised because it's something I had not read about before. And what they were doing at that meeting 25 years ago was part of a broader process of the Ukrainian Canadian community to begin to educate decision makers, opinion leaders about the First World War internment. I think a lot of Canadians I think vast majority of Canadians are aware of the Second World War internment of Japanese Canadians. Technically, they weren't actually interned, but they were forced to move away from the West Coast. Their property was expropriated, and Prime Minister Mulroney made a formal apology and redress to Canadians of Japanese origin for the injustice of that internment operation when he was Prime Minister, I think in 1988. And so that took a lot of profile, but the truth is this, that it wasn't until a history professor at the Royal Military College in Kingston named Lubomir Lutsuk started to read archives. He had heard some rumors in the community about this, and he started to go up to Ottawa and dived through the archives, and lo and behold, started to find evidence of this. I think what happened was that the internees after the war, and by the way, some of the camps stayed open all the way until I think 1920, but after the camps were closed and the internees returned back to their normal Canadian lives, they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to pass on the memory of it to their kids. They felt they were ashamed. They felt that they had been somehow judged by the Canadian government as disloyal, and they didn't want to talk about that. It was a bitter, sad, sorrowful experience that they just internalized. They just kind of repressed and didn't demand recognition, didn't demand apologies or redress. Meanwhile, the Dominion government, the Canadian government, destroyed a lot of the records, knocked down the buildings in the camps, and the Canadian government had an interest in just kind of putting it to bed and moving on. So it really wasn't until Professor Luciuk did his research in the 1990s. I think he did a very important article, if I'm not mistaken, in the Canadian Historical Journal in the late 1990s on his initial evidence. That's what started to break it open, and then that's when the Ukrainian Canadian community said we need to have a serious public discussion about the issue, and that's how I got educated about it as an opposition MP 25 years ago.
And how did that conversation with the community change your perspective?
Well, it was astonishing to me to find this really kind of morbid part of Canadian history about which I knew nothing. And I will say that a few years later, I had the privilege of being appointed Secretary of State for Multiculturalism by Prime Minister Harper. One of the very first things I was working on was redress for the injustice of the Chinese Head Tax and Exclusion Act, which was a series of racist policies designed to effectively prevent people of Chinese ethnicity from migrating to Canada. And based on the model of Prime Minister Mulroney's redress for the Second World War Japanese dislocation and internment, I led some consultations with older Chinese Canadians, some of whom had actually paid the head tax, to figure out what we should do there. And we went through that whole process. And around that time, the Ukrainian Canadian community approached me and said, hey, we think it's time for a formal recognition of what happened. They actually didn't ask for an apology per se, but appropriate historical recognition and redress. And I'll have to be honest, we didn't really have a template for that sort of thing. The Mulroney apology and redress for the Japanese relocation policy of the Second War was really the first time the Canadian government ever done something like this. And I got to tell you, you're a former Attorney General and you're a lawyer. You know that government lawyers are very risk averse, and they go to work every day to protect the Crown, the government. And the government lawyers kept telling us, you don't want to acknowledge that anything wrong happened. You certainly don't want to apologize, because in so doing, you're opening us up, the government up, for all sorts of potential civil claims and financial liability. So the advice that governments had received for decades, and different partisan stripes, was just don't deal with this stuff. And I think there was also, Tyler, a view, which is totally understandable, the view held by Pierre Trudeau on these things, which is that, contrary to Scripture, the sins of the fathers should not be visited upon the sons. That is to say, that the sins, the wrongdoing of previous generations should not be, there's no culpability in successive generations for those historic injustices. So there was a resistance, but I had to work my way through that with the Ukrainian community.
Wow. Something you said there reminded me of a speech I heard you give, not on internment operations. I think it was about commemoration of Holodomor, but you have quoted Elie Wiesel's Nobel Prize winning acceptance speech and about the duty of remembrance, the duty of Zahor. Tell me, because that is important to you, the duty of remembrance, how that affected how you dealt with the situation.
Yes, as Elie Wiesel said in that speech, it is incumbent upon us to remember the evil that we have, the good that we have enjoyed and the evil that we have suffered. And there is no duty, there's no commandment in the Bible that is more frequently made and more insistently than the call to remember, the duty to remember. The Hebrew word is zahor. And that's his whole life was an act of remembrance for the victims of the Holocaust of the European Jewish people. You know me, I'm a big history buff, as I've said, and I'm distressed that there has been an almost purposeful campaign of historical amnesia in Canada. You can graduate from high school in 7 of our 10 provinces without ever having properly studied Canadian history or civics. You know, I think there's a course in grade 6, but there's no sustained like high school serious study of Canadian history. And then more recently, we've had this this trendy, woke, critical theory coming out of the universities and infecting media and now politics, government institutions, and which says that basically Canada is virtually an illegitimate settler state that is steeped in genocide itself and institutional racism, and that basically, you know, the Canada is an immoral enterprise. I find this stuff really offensive. And I think the way to address it is through a proper, factual, balanced understanding of our real history, which understands why is it that Canada is seen as a beacon around the world? Why do people all around the world want to come here? Imperfect though we may be, how have we built one of the greatest countries in human history in terms of freedom and opportunity? And if we're going to celebrate those achievements, the achievements of our history, we must also acknowledge the wrongdoings and the injustices in our history. So I take not a kind of Pollyannish view of Canadian history, which is that we should gloss over, deny, or minimize those injustices. We should acknowledge them, but not obsess over them. And I think that's the challenge for us, which is how do you acknowledge those wrongs, learn from them, and move on. And I must say, I found the approach of the Ukrainian Canadian community organizations very constructive in that regard. They weren't asking for a formal apology. They weren't asking for sort of sackcloth and ashes. They were asking for appropriate historical recognition and redress that would recover the memory of the internees of the injustice they suffered, and transmit that memory into the future through various projects, documentaries, memorials, statues, cultural projects, restoring a couple of the camps as a kind of testament and museum. It was a really, I think, mature model for how to deal with historical injustices.
And from that meeting 25 years ago to the announcement of the redress settlement, which was, I think, in May of 2008, there is now a fairly famous photo in the Ukrainian community of you with delegates from the Ukrainian community at that announcement. Do you have memories of that?
Yeah, I should say before we got to that while I've commended the community organizations for their really, I think, visionary approach to redress around First World War internment operations, they were also really tough negotiators, particularly my friend Paul Grod, at the time president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. He had just been elected, but he was part of the negotiating team with Andy Holodchevsky of the Ukrainian Canadian Foundation, Taras Shevchenko, the then president as well of the UCHIBA, the Ukrainian Canadian Business Professional Association, and in the wings, but very much pushing hard, was Lyubomir Luchuk, the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association, who had discovered the issue. And those guys were, let me tell you, they were like a dog with a bone. And I must be honest with you, Tyler, I did not have a mandate from Prime Minister Harper to deal with this. Even, most of the people in our government, you know, PM Harper himself is a history buff. I'm not sure what his knowledge level was, but very few people in the government had heard about this, and I had no budget to negotiate redress. So I was between a rock and a hard place for about a year, 18 months, between those Ukrainian groups led primarily by Paul Grod and the. I think it's a long enough go. I had a senior minister at the time who was not interested in this at all. I was at Canadian Heritage as a junior minister. She didn't want to give me any money. She thought the whole thing was not worth our time. So I had and you've been in these fights in government where you're you're trying to persuade your colleagues to open the purse strings and let you solve a problem. And eventually we got that done. And that, it was a great...
Was it just the quantum? Were there any other sticking points?
Yeah, it was the whole thing. But any money, how much money, what it would go for, should the government manage it, should the community manage it. The community's position was that the Shevchenko Foundation should manage it because it was set up already with the infrastructure and an endowment to support Ukrainian cultural projects. I thought that made sense. As a conservative, I believe, empower civil society to do the job. That's what we landed on, and we signed the agreement on the grounds of the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto, as you say, in May of 2008, in the facility where the internees in Toronto were rounded up when they were taken by the police, by the RCMP. Before they were sent to the internment camps, they camped out and were processed at this facility at the Canadian National Exhibition, and that's where we signed it. So it was a very touching moment.
Wow. You mentioned World War II internment of Japanese Canadians. You mentioned as well high-ranking officials within the government back in 2008 not being aware of the issue. There's a fairly famous now documentary of internment operations called It Never Happened. And I actually, just in 2023, when I was still a minister, had a conversation with a high-ranking person in Alberta, not somebody in government, but somebody who was high-ranking. And I remember talking to this person about my advocacy with the Ukrainian community for a statue on the legislative grounds. And I remember her asking me, why would the Ukrainian community want a statue about internment? Why would they care about Japanese Canadians? And I was shocked, and I told her about the issue, and she ended up saying to me, that never happened, the exact title of the documentary. So the fact that you had people in 2008 who didn't know about the issue was not shocking at all.
Which is why these projects were necessary, and there's a lot more educational work to be done. But the degree of ignorance about it is astonishing. And there's one aspect I need to introduce. Another one of the complexities in the negotiations, Tyler, was this. The government was approached by the Ukrainian Canadian community, by several organizations in it. And it's a very well organized community. One of the things I admire most about the Ukrainian Canadian community is how loyal multi-generational Canadian Ukrainian descendants are to their identity. I'm talking, fourth and fifth generation. I mean, former Premier Stelmach is, I think, third gen, and he didn't speak English until he went to grade school. That's how deliberate the community has always been about retaining its identity. There was, though, a nuance in the First World War internment operations, which is that it wasn't simply, and I sometimes have to remind my Ukrainian friends this, it was not an ethnic racism directed exclusively at Ukrainians. It affected foreign nationals who had come to Canada from Axis countries in the First World War, that is to say, from essentially Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so that included at least a dozen different ethnicities. Obviously, in fact, Ukraine didn't exist in 1914 as a formal modern republic. Ukraine existed as an idea, as an identity, historically grounded, but there were what we then called in Canada Bukovinians or Galicians from Western Ukraine. There were Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Slovenians, Croatians, Serbians, Dalmatians, others, Austrians, and even some Germans who were interned. And so what I was trying to get to the Ukrainian community, I said, look, please, let's reach out to these other communities in Canada, make them aware of what happened, bring them into the solution, make sure that they're included in some of the funding, the projects, and the commemoration. So it's a broader Canadian experience, not an exclusively Ukrainian Canadian experience.
Correct. You talked about the innovative approach that the Ukrainian community had when they approached you to this issue. Are there other lessons that Canadians should take from the redress settlement from 2008? Are there any lessons that we're forgetting as Canadians?
Well, I think the core lesson is what we've been talking about, which is the need to know our history, the good and the bad. And it strikes me as another aspect of this is we need to acknowledge that there were many proud ethnic Ukrainian Canadians who volunteered for, died for, bled for, fought for Canada, the Dominion, and the Crown on the front lines of the Great War, including some who won the Victoria Cross. So we had Ukrainian Canadians achieving the highest levels of valor in defense of a country that was actually interning some of their fellow nationals. And I find that really astonishing. It reminds me of, I talked earlier about the Chinese head tax. Well, there was also the Exclusion Act, and Chinese Canadians exclusively were barred from citizenship until 1947. And the guy who campaigned so hard to reverse that was a Chinese Canadian named Doug Zhang, who volunteered with a bunch of other Chinese for the Canadian Special Forces to operate behind Japanese enemy lines in the Asian theater, particularly in Manchuria. And it was through their bravery and their service to a country that would not give them citizenship that they won citizenship. He became the first non-Caucasian Canadian MP elected with Diefenbaker in '57, and I named the Government of Canada office building after Doug Zhang. So to say, like, this is a Canadian civil rights hero, and I think there are a lot of Ukrainian Canadian civil rights heroes of the Great War that we need better to acknowledge as well.
You mentioned the difficulty with the government lawyers in the potential liability that government might be open to. There were difficult negotiations about the $10 million settlement for that would go to the recognition fund. But now, as we look 20 years later, do you have any thoughts on the achievements of the fund over the last 20 years?
Yeah, there have been so many good projects. And again, this is part of the wisdom of the community to ask for an endowment. So it would generate revenue that could fund projects in perpetuity if well managed. And that's what's happening. I mean, look, any endowment fund has some ups and downs in terms of its investment and its value. But that was a much, much smarter approach than just getting us writing a check and the community spending it on a bunch of projects, because that would have disappeared 10, 15 years ago. And when I say disappeared, I mean those projects that would have been spent, there'd be some durable projects. But now it's something that a generation from now, 2 generations from now, young Canadians of Ukrainian origin who have no direct personal connection to those events will still be coming to community events to commemorate this. They'll see the memorials, they'll see the plaques, they'll see documentaries that have been produced, and they'll be challenged to do their own part as well. I think that's really cool. It's about transmitting the memory. That's what the endowment allows for.